The fluorescent lights hummed overhead at Oak Creek Memorial, a sound like insects trapped in plastic. 3 years. That's how long Brooke Sullivan had worked the day shift in the cardiac ward, and in that time she'd become the kind of nurse people forgot was in the room. Not because she was invisible, she was methodical, precise, the one who caught medication errors before they reached a patient, but because she'd mastered the art of occupying space without demanding it. Her hands, scarred along the knuckles in patterns that looked almost tactical, moved with surgical confidence as she checked the vitals on room 7. The old man inside barely glanced at her. Nobody ever did anymore. The scrubs she wore were standard navy blue, but underneath the collar sat something that would have meant everything to someone who knew what they were looking at, a faded unit patch sewn into the jacket lining, so close to her heart that she could feel it through 2 layers of fabric. The patch was old enough that the embroidery had started to fray at the edges, the colors muted by time and washing. She'd kept it through 3 years of deliberate mediocrity, 3 years of keeping her head down in a place that would have crucified her if anyone ever knew what that patch represented. Brooke checked the clock on the wall. 7:14 a.m. The morning shift had barely begun, and already the unit was moving with its familiar rhythm, medications being distributed, family members arriving with coffee cups, the smell of stale antiseptic mixing with the acrid undertone of the cleaning solution they'd used on the floors at 5 a.m. She'd been here long enough to know the patterns of Oak Creek Memorial like she knew the sound of her own heartbeat. She knew which doctors demanded their charts pre-rounded, which nurses cut corners on hand hygiene, which patients were secretly scared enough to ask her the questions they wouldn't ask the physicians. She was running labs from room 12 when Dr. Marcus Hargrove rounded the corner, his white coat pristine and his expression already arranged into something between annoyance and contempt. He had that particular look about him, the kind of doctor who'd never spent a night in the field, who'd never held someone's hand while they bled out, who believed the hierarchy of medicine was exactly as rigid as it appeared. Hargrove was tall, built like a man who went to the gym with the same calculation he applied to everything else, and his presence seemed to make the corridor feel smaller. Sullivan. He said her name like it was a task he needed to complete. 3 other nurses were within earshot, Jessica at the med cart, Tom pulling labs, and Rachel checking a monitor at the nurse's station. The Johnson family in room 4 is questioning the medication administration from night shift. I need you to walk me through your assessment. Brooke turned from the computer terminal, her fingers stilling on the keyboard. She'd given the Johnson family's father his digoxin at 6 a.m., the dose calculated to his body weight, his renal function, his current cardiac rhythm. She double-checked it against the standing order. She documented it with the precision that had kept her alive in places where imprecision meant body bags. Yes, doctor. Your notes say you assessed for drug interactions. Hargrove's tone made it sound like she'd invented the interaction herself, like she'd pulled it out of thin air instead of from the medication reference her clinical judgment had flagged. That's outside your scope. The room didn't go quiet, exactly, but Brooke felt it shift. Jessica's hand slowed at the med cart. Tom turned just slightly, suddenly very interested in the lab drawer he'd been reaching toward. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, an almost living thing in the space between them. Brooke took one measured breath. 3 years of this. Hargrove had been testing the perimeter of her patient since her first week at Oak Creek, and she'd learned that the only way to survive was to absorb each hit without flinching. To respond with her voice at exactly the same register it had been before he'd opened his mouth. The patient is on metoprolol and diltiazem concurrently, Brooke said quietly. Both are negative inotropes. Digoxin concentration can increase by up to 40% in the presence of concurrent beta blockers. I documented the observation. You documented an observation that wasn't your job to make. Hargrove's voice carried just enough edge that the other nurses could hear it, could hear the correction, could hear the implied incompetence. The physician orders. The nurse executes. That's the hierarchy, Sullivan. That's why you're standing where you are and I'm standing where I am. One tear formed at the corner of her right eye. Brooke let it happen. She didn't blink, didn't turn away, didn't break eye contact. She simply waited until it reached the edge of her cheekbone and then wiped it away with the back of her scarred hand, the movement casual enough that it could have been anything: dust, the dry air from the fax system, fatigue. Nothing to do with the man in front of her at all. "Understood, doctor," she said, and her voice was so calm it seemed to unsettle him slightly. He'd expected something else, defensiveness, maybe, or tears that turned into apologies, or the kind of emotional reaction that would have given him something to work with. Instead, Brooke said, "I've survived worse than you." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Hargrove's jaw tightened in a way that suggested he wasn't accustomed to being left without the last word, and he turned and walked back down the corridor toward the physician's lounge without responding. Jessica had already looked away, Tom was definitely focused on his lab drawer, and Rachel was studying her monitor with the intensity of someone reading top-secret intelligence. Brooke turned back to the computer and pulled up Room 12's chart. The admission had come through emergency intake sometime during night shift, a 56-year-old male, head trauma and blunt force trauma to the thorax, assaulted in the waiting room of all places. The emergency department had stabilized him, moved him up to the cardiac ward because of some arrhythmias they'd flagged, and now he was resting in the room at the end of the corridor. She'd see him when she did rounds. She'd check his vitals like she checked everyone's vitals. She'd be the quiet, competent nurse that nobody noticed. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was that when she walked into that room in approximately 4 hours, the man in the bed would open his eyes and recognize something in her face that would change the entire architecture of her invisible life. But that wasn't now. Now was processing insurance forms, reviewing the daily admissions, moving through the hospital like a ghost in scrubs. The billing discrepancies showed up on her screen sometime around 10 a.m. while she was processing insurance documentation for Dr. Hargrove's patients. Oak Creek had started requiring nurses to do preliminary insurance reviews, a money-saving measure that had shifted administrative tasks down the hierarchy in exactly the way Hargrove must have hated. But it meant Brooke was the one reading through the codes, comparing the billed services against the documented procedures. Room 3, Cardiac Catheterization. Billed at $47,000. Brooke pulled up the procedure notes. The documentation mentioned diagnostic observation but listed no actual intervention. No stent placement, no vessel imaging, no angiography data in the medical record. Just an observation coded as an invasive procedure. Room 6, Electrophysiology Study. Billed at $63,000. The chart showed a patient with no arrhythmias, no indication for the study, admitted specifically for medication management. No EP study had actually been performed. Room 9, Multiple catheterizations over the past 6 weeks. Billed to 3 different insurance companies. The procedures listed in the billing codes didn't match the actual documentation in any of the charts. Brooke pulled up the pattern across all of Hargrove's current patients. 7 charts. $53,000 to $123,000 per chart. Procedures documented in billing that didn't exist in the medical record, or procedures that had been documented as billable when they'd actually been routine assessments. She didn't move. She didn't pick up her phone or call anyone or flag the discrepancy to her charge nurse. She simply closed the folder and filed it in the back of her consciousness, the place where she'd learned to keep dangerous information. Pain was information. So was this. And information could wait until she understood exactly what she was looking at. The morning moved forward. Meds, vitals, patient education, wound checks. The usual architecture of a cardiac ward shift, the small injuries and small victories that no one documented because they happened in the spaces between the dramatic moments. A patient's blood pressure finally stabilizing after 3 days. A family member finally understanding their father's medication regimen. The simple relief on someone's face when they realized they weren't dying. Around 2:33 p.m., Brooke heard the commotion from the ER, raised voices, the kind of controlled chaos that meant a critical admission was coming up to the floor. She didn't investigate. That wasn't her job. Her job was to stay in her lane, to do her work, to remain the kind of invisible that kept her alive. Room 12 was getting company. The moment Brooke stepped into Room 7, she knew something was wrong. The family was gathered too close, 3 adults crowded against the bed rail, their postures tight with anxiety. Mrs. Chen lay on the mattress, post-op from a routine cholecystectomy, her 4-line running clear saline at a steady drip. Brooke had been assigned to administer the antibiotic, cefazolin, 2 grams, intravenous push, ordered 4 hours ago. She'd waited this long because the surgical team wanted to monitor renal function first. Now it was time. She moved with the efficiency that had kept her invisible for 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial. Scrubs crisp. Badge clipped. Hand steady. She drew up the medication, checked it twice against the chart, and approached the four-port with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory, though no one here would have recognized muscle memory in a woman who pushed a medication cart. Administering cefazolin now, Mrs. Chen. You might feel a slight coolness in your arm. The medication went in clean. The 4-line was patent. The administration was textbook, no extravasation, no resistance, no complication of any kind. That's when the door swung open. Dr. Marcus Hargrove filled the frame like a storm system moving in. 38 years old. Ivy League credentials framed on his office wall. The kind of surgeon who wore a $4,000 watch and never looked directly at anyone who couldn't advance his career. Behind him came 2 residents trailing like satellites caught in his gravitational field. Ms. Sullivan. Not Brooke. Never Brooke. What exactly did you just inject into my patient? Brooke kept her hand steady. Kept her voice level. Cefazolin, 2 grams per your 1400 order. The 1400 order. Hargrove moved closer, his eyes fixed not on her but on the family, making sure they were watching. The order that specifically indicated we needed to delay administration until post-op renal labs came back, which they did, at 18:30, showing a creatinine of 3.2. Elevated. Significantly. And what does a competent nurse do with elevated renal function in a post-op patient? Mrs. Chen's daughter stepped forward. Is she okay? She's fine, Brooke said quietly. Cefazolin is cleared for use in renal impairment at adjusted intervals. Dr. Hargrove ordered this medication. I administered it appropriately. You administered it without consulting me. Hargrove's voice didn't rise. That was worse. Without checking current labs. Without the basic clinical judgment that separates actual nurses from people who simply push buttons and hope for the best. He turned to the family, his expression the picture of concerned professionalism. I apologize. Staffing challenges have meant we're working with less experienced personnel than we'd prefer. Mrs. Chen will be monitored closely, but this should have been caught. One of the residents glanced at Brooke with something that might have been pity. The other looked away entirely. Brooke felt the moment crystallize, the specific temperature of public humiliation in a medical setting. She could have defended herself. Could have cited the protocol. Could have pulled the chart and shown them the exact wording of the order. Instead, she took one measured breath through her nose and said, "The medication is appropriate, doctor." Mrs. Chen's lab support administration. That wasn't my assessment. Hargrove was already turning away, satisfied. Let's monitor her closely. And perhaps next time, Ms. Sullivan, you'll remember that to just a nurse means exactly that. The residents followed him out. Mrs. Chen's family shifted uncomfortably, their confidence in her care now infected with doubt. Brooke finished checking the 4, documented the administration, and left the room with her spine straight and her face composed, even though her pulse had shifted into something harder. But that wasn't the worst part. The break room at Oak Creek Memorial was a narrow space with a refrigerator that hummed like a dying animal, a microwave that smelled of popcorn from someone's lunch in 2019, and 4 chairs arranged around a chipped Formica table. At 19:11 on a Tuesday night, Brooke pushed through the door with her own meal, a sandwich she'd prepared that morning, and sat at the table's edge. The room held for other nurses. They'd been mid-conversation, but the word stopped the moment her scrubs crossed the threshold. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Just a unified pause, like a flock of birds registering movement in the periphery. One by one, they gathered their things. Patricia, who worked nights on the cardiac floor. Michelle from surgery. James from the ER. They drifted out without making eye contact, without a single word, leaving Brooke alone with her sandwich and the hum of the refrigerator. She sat for 3 minutes in that silence. Then she threw the sandwich away uneaten and went back to the floor. It wasn't accident. It was choreography. Someone had coordinated this, probably Hargrove, or someone who owed him enough to make it happen. Brooke had seen isolation tactics in military operations, had watched entire forward operating bases turn their backs on someone marked for removal. The mechanism was always the same. Create doubt. Create distance. Make the target invisible while everyone watched. She made it to 2213 before it got worse. The unit bulletin board was posted next to the medication dispensary, a corkboard covered in scheduling notices, CEU announcements, and the kind of administrative detritus that nobody read. Except this bulletin had something new thumbtacked directly in the center, printed on hospital letterhead, official enough to make staff pause as they passed. Disciplinary notice, incident report. Date, today. Name, Brooke Sullivan. Violation, patient endangerment. Improper medication administration resulting in unnecessary patient exposure. Recommended action, mandatory retraining. It was signed by someone in HR, someone who had probably never heard Brooke's voice. There was no incident. There was no endangerment. The medication was appropriate and the patient was stable. Brooke had checked Mrs. Chen's vitals herself at 2100. Everything normal. Everything fine. But the notice didn't require accuracy, it required visibility. It required everyone walking past to see her name paired with negligence. 3 nurses read it while Brooke was standing there. One of them, Marcus from day shift, looked at her with something like apology before moving on. The others simply stared at the board and didn't make eye contact. Brooke took the notice down. It was still hers to remove, Hargrove hadn't owned the space yet. She folded it into her pocket, and the fact that her hands didn't shake was the only evidence she had that any of this was affecting her at all. The hallway outside the medication room was empty at 2347. The night shift had settled into its rhythm, lights dimmed in patient rooms, monitors beeping their steady patterns, the building moving into the slower metabolism of midnight hours. Brooke had just finished documenting on her last patient when she heard the footsteps. Hargrove's gait, deliberate, possessive, the way he moved through hallways like he owned the tile itself. "We need to talk about your future here, Ms. Sullivan." She turned. Took one measured breath. Her hand stayed at her sides, relaxed, the way a hunter relaxes before a strike. "My patient care is appropriate, doctor. Your patient care is reckless." He stepped closer, his voice low enough that the residents at the far end of the hallway wouldn't hear. "You're creating liability. You're creating doubt. You're becoming a problem, and I solve problems." She held his gaze. Didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Just waited. "I have contacts at Memorial Health Systems. 3 board members who take my calls." His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of institutional authority. "I'm reaching out to your previous hospital, Cedar Hills, correct? I'm having a conversation with their HR director about why you left so abruptly 3 years ago. I'm also commissioning an external audit of your credentials. All very routine. Very procedural." The hallway seemed to contract. Brooke felt the walls of her invisibility starting to crack, not because of what he was saying, but because of what it meant. He was moving beyond humiliation into something more tactical. He wasn't just trying to break her. He was trying to erase her. One tear escaped. Just one. It traced down her cheek, and she wiped it without breaking eye contact. "I've survived worse than you, doctor," she said. Her voice was so quiet he had to lean in to hear it. Much worse. Something in her tone unnerved him. She saw it, a microscopic shift in his posture, a hesitation that lasted exactly 0.8 seconds. He'd been expecting fear. Expecting tears and apologies. Instead, he'd gotten something else. Something that sounded like someone who had already survived things that would have broken ordinary people. "Well," he said, stepping back. "We'll see how you survive this." He walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor and around the corner. Brooke stood alone in the medication room, her hand steady, her composure intact, her survival instincts already calculating 3 moves ahead. She'd been erased once before. She knew how this worked. But she didn't know that in exactly 14 minutes, the ambulance bay doors would crash open. She didn't know that the night was about to shatter. She didn't know that everything she'd spent 3 years concealing was about to wake up. The intercom crackled at 0006 hours. Code blue in the waiting room. Multiple patients. All of them military. All of them injured. And that's when the real nightmare began. The monitor screamed first. 3 sharp beeps, then a wail that cut through the controlled chaos of the ER like a blade finding its mark. Captain Miller's oxygen saturation plummeted from 94 to 87 in seconds. His chest heaved against the mattress. His eyes went wide. Wide like a man watching his own drowning happen from the inside out. "He's crashing," someone said. Not a question. An observation of fact. Brooke was 2 trauma bays over, finishing a dressing change on a construction worker's lacerated forearm. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that sickly yellow-white that made wounds look worse than they were. She heard the monitor and her body answered before her mind caught up. Her hands moved. Just moved. The gauze dropped. The gloves came off. She was walking toward the sound before conscious thought arrived. The ER had descended into that particular flavor of controlled panic that only happens when you have critically unstable patients and no one clear taking command. 3 nurses clustered around Miller's bed. One was checking the fall line. Another was adjusting oxygen. A third stood frozen, phone halfway to her ear, as if the act of calling for help might require permission she didn't have. "Get respiratory," Brooke said. Not a question. Not please. Just the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The frozen nurse jumped. The monitor continued its wail. 84. 82. 80 now. Captain Miller's skin was taking on that grey-blue tint that meant his circulation was failing. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. His hands clawed at the sheets. Brooke stepped to the bed and looked down at him. Really looked. Disheveled dark hair. Strong jaw. The remnants of dried blood in the creases of his neck from the beating he'd taken in the waiting room. And his eyes. His eyes locked onto hers for one singular moment, and she saw something there. Recognition. Confusion. The look of a soldier watching another soldier from across a canyon. She didn't acknowledge it. She couldn't afford to. "Where's Dr. Hargrove?" she asked no one in particular. "Trauma Bay 1, someone said. With the MVA. Brooke's jaw tightened. MVA. Motor vehicle accident. Routine. Not like this. Not like a man whose right lung was filling with blood from a traumatic injury the intake team had somehow missed. She could see it now, the way his breathing was becoming more labored, the way his blood pressure was tanking. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid around the heart, compressing it, choking off his circulation. Every heartbeat weaker than the last. 80. 78. 75. "Call for a cardiothoracic consult," Brooke said. Hargrove said no consults without his approval. "I don't care what Hargrove said. Call them. Now." The nurse hesitated. That 1-second hesitation that meant she was calculating the risk of defying the attending physician against the risk of watching a patient die. Brooke didn't give her time to finish the math. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath needle, a 10-milliliter syringe, and an ultrasound machine." Her voice had dropped an octave. The timid nurse who accepted humiliation with measured breathing had gone somewhere else. Something older was walking through her body now. Something that had spent 12 years learning exactly how to keep people alive when everything was falling apart. A nurse, faster than the others, sharper, was moving before Brooke finished talking. Getting the supplies. Pulling the ultrasound cart. The room seemed to tighten around them. Tighten like a fist. Captain Miller's oxygen dropped to 72. Brooke pulled on fresh gloves. Latex snapped like small gunshots against the silence. She positioned the ultrasound probe against his chest wall, just below the ribcage. The screen flickered to life. Black and white. 2 chambers. And there. The dark crescent moon of fluid where it shouldn't be. Blood pooling in the pericardial sac like water filling a closed fist. The heart struggling inside its own prison. 70, a nurse whispered. Brooke marked the spot with her finger. 2 rigs below, at the xiphoid process. She swabbed with betadine. The smell of iodine filled the small space around them. She positioned the needle. Not thinking. Hands that had done this in field hospitals under mortar fire. Hands that remembered the feel of skin and muscle and the particular resistance of the pericardial membrane. She pushed. "What is she doing?" someone asked. The needle found the space between ribs. Brooke's wrist twisted. The needle advanced another centimeter. Another. Her breath came slow and measured. Pain was information. Pain was data. The subtle change in resistance beneath her fingertips told her everything. She was in. She attached the syringe. Dark blood bloomed into the chamber. Rich blood. Old blood that had been sitting there for hours, accumulating, pressing. She drew back on the plunger. 5 milliliters. 10. 15. 20. The monitor's wail changed pitch. 72. 75. 78. 82, she heard herself say. 25 milliliters. The pressure relief was almost visible now. Captain Miller's chest expanded. His breathing deepened. The color began returning to his face in increments, like a photograph developing in reverse darkness. 30 milliliters. 88. She secured the needle. Bandaged the site. Step back. 90. 92. Stable. The room exhaled as one. Brooke stripped the gloves and dropped them into the hazmat bin. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. Not in the moment. Not when someone's life was balanced on the edge of a blade and the only thing between them and the dark was the muscle memory of 12 years. "Get an EKG," she said quietly. "Stat chest X-ray. Notify cardiothoracics that we have a pericardial effusion post-trauma. They need to see him." The nurses moved. Efficient. Obedient. Something had shifted in the room. Some fundamental balance of authority had realigned itself and no one was talking about it yet, but everyone felt it. Dr. Hargrove emerged from Trauma Bay 6 minutes later. He looked disheveled. His tie was loosened. He walked toward Miller's bed with the confident stride of a man about to take credit for someone else's work. He saw Brooke standing at the monitor reading the EKG printout. He saw the secured pericardiocentesis site. He saw the numbers on the screen. 94%. Stable. Sinus rhythm. "What happened?" he demanded. "Cardiac tamponade." Brooke didn't look up from the EKG. Pericardial effusion secondary to the pneumothorax. The trauma team missed it on initial assessment. Hargrove's face darkened. "I didn't authorize." "Your patient was dying, doctor." She looked at him then. Just for a moment. Her eyes meeting his with the weight of someone who had stood in operating theaters with blood on her hands and made decisions that meant the difference between a body bag and going home. "I stabilized him." The words hung in the air like a held breath. Captain Miller opened his eyes. His gaze moved across the room until it found Brooke. His lips moved. Barely. Just enough sound to escape. One word. So quiet the monitors almost drowned it out. Valkyrie. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain beginning to hammer against the ER windows. Outside, the sky was turning the color of a bruise. But that wasn't the worst part. Not for Hargrove. He was already moving. Already running calculations. A nurse had just performed an emergency procedure without his authorization. A nurse had just contradicted him in front of staff. A nurse had just saved a patient's life in a way that made the attending physician look absent. Incompetent. He was already reaching for his phone, his fingers working through his mental catalogue of board members, allies, people who owed him favors. He was already composing the narrative in his head. A nurse who overstepped. A nurse who didn't follow chain of command. A nurse whose credentials needed questioning. He didn't know what she was. He didn't understand what he'd just seen walking through his hospital in scrubs and a name badge. But he was going to find out. And when he did, he was going to make sure she burned. Dr. Hargrove stopped in the doorway of the intensive care unit, his expression freezing as he took in the scene before him. Captain Miller's monitor displayed the rhythm Hargrove had been too busy orchestrating to achieve himself, sinus rhythm, steady and strong at 74 beats per minute. The cardiac tamponade that should have killed the man was gone. The fluid around his heart had been evacuated with surgical precision. Brooke stood beside the bed, her hand steady as they adjusted the fall line, her face revealing nothing. Hargrove's eyes narrowed as he watched her work with the fluid certainty of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. What happened here? His voice came out thin, controlled, dangerous. Brooke didn't look at him. Patient decompensated. Pericardiocentesis was indicated. We got sinus rhythm. The second-year resident who'd been frozen at the monitor spoke up. She did it. 1 needle, under 40 seconds. I've never seen. I didn't ask you. Hargrove cut her off without looking. His attention remained on Brooke, studying her face like he was seeing it for the first time. Or like he was seeing something he'd suspected all along finally confirmed. She had saved a man's life with the kind of precision that belonged in an operating room, not in the hands of a floor nurse. Not in the hands of someone he'd spent 3 years erasing from conversations, from assignments, from the casual acknowledgement that made a person belong somewhere. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Hargrove turned and left the unit. His phone was in his hand before he reached the elevator. The first call went to Dr. Raymond Sterling, the hospital's board chairman and the man who'd approved Hargrove's expansion into the private billing services that paid him an extra $140,000 annually. Raymond. We have a situation. The nurse I mentioned. Sullivan. She just performed an emergency procedure she had no authority to perform. I want her credentials audited. Complete background check. Everything. Hargrove's voice carried the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to being obeyed. I'm concerned about her qualifications. Patient safety issue. You understand. The second call went to Memorial Hospital in Charlotte, where Brooke had worked for 4 years before transferring to Oak Creek. This is Dr. Marcus Hargrove at Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh. I'm calling regarding a previous employee, Brooke Sullivan. She applied for a position here and listed your facility as a reference. I have some concerns about her clinical competence. Did she ever demonstrate any unusual procedures? Any procedures she wasn't credentialed for? Any disciplinary issues you might not have documented? The questions were phrased with the precision of a hunter setting traps. By the time the call ended, the administrator in Charlotte was pulling her old files, looking for anything that might support what he'd implied. The third call went to an outside investigator Hargrove kept on retainer, a former state licensing board auditor who owed Hargrove a favor after Hargrove had helped him avoid questions about a daughter's pharmaceutical license. I need a full credential audit on a nurse. Today if possible. Brooke Sullivan, license number. Hargrove read it off from the employee directory. I need to know if there are any gaps in her documentation, any procedures she performed outside her scope of practice, any red flags in her background. I'll pay double your rate. This is time sensitive. By 2:13 p.m., the investigator was in the hospital's Human Resources office, requesting Brooke's complete personnel file. By 2:44 p.m., he was on the phone with Hargrove. "I found something." Her record shows a 4-year gap in employment between 2014 and 2018. No explanation. No documentation of where she was. It's a red flag. What the investigator didn't know, what Hargrove didn't know, was that those 4 years represented a classified deployment. Those 4 years were buried under federal orders that made them invisible to civilian databases. Those 4 years were why Brooke's records had been sealed and her name essentially erased from military rosters. But Hargrove needed only enough circumstantial evidence to move. By 3:17 p.m., he had called an emergency meeting with the hospital's chief medical officer and 2 members of the Quality Assurance Committee. By 4:06 p.m., Brooke was being escorted from the building by security. Her badge was taken at the entrance. Her shift was terminated for performing procedures outside her scope of practice without physician authorization. The official termination letter cited patient safety concerns pending investigation. "You have 30 minutes to clear your locker," the security guard said. He wasn't unkind about it, but the message was absolute. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Brooke opened her locker with the combination she'd used every single day for 3 years. She pulled down her spare shoes, her personal items, the small framed photo of her son in his army dress uniform. At the bottom of the locker, beneath a spare pair of scrubs, she found what she'd kept hidden there since the day she'd arrived at Oak Creek Memorial, her jacket. The one with the faded army patch sewn into the lining. The one with her unit's insignia stitched in the corner, small enough that only someone looking for it would see it. She held it in her hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, the history of it, the life it represented that was supposed to be dead. She packed it carefully in the cardboard box the security guard had provided. By 5:22 p.m., Brooke was driving home through Raleigh's early evening traffic, her personnel file in a manila envelope on the passenger seat, her career at Oak Creek Memorial officially terminated and under investigation for misconduct. The accusation was professional negligence. The real crime was that she had been too competent, too skilled, too noticeably different from what Hargrove had expected from a floor nurse. Her son's car was in the driveway at 5:38 p.m., 2 hours before he was supposed to be home from his job in IT support. She could see him through the kitchen window, and when she walked in, his face told her he knew something was wrong. She could read people the way she could read monitors, the slight tension around his eyes, the careful composure he'd inherited from her. "Hey, Mom." He moved toward her, searching her face. "Why aren't you at work?" She sat down at the kitchen table. The cardboard box of her locker contents was still in her hands. Her jacket was inside it, and beneath the jacket, the 3 years of security badges she'd accumulated, the employee handbook, the lunch container she'd brought from home and forgotten. She didn't set the box down. She held it against her chest like a shield. "I had to leave early. Are you okay?" He pulled out the chair across from her, his medical instinct activating, scanning for injury, for pain, for the things that made people fall apart. Did something happen? She couldn't tell him. She couldn't say that his mother, who had survived Tikrit, who had led combat operations, who had looked into the eyes of men who wanted her dead and never flinched, had been destroyed by a man stealing from insurance companies. She couldn't tell him that she'd lost her job because she'd saved someone's life. She couldn't tell him that the woman who had trained him in hand-to-hand combat when he was 12 years old, who had taught him that strength meant precision and control, was now sitting at the kitchen table unable to look him in the eye. The tears came without permission. Silent. Hot. She wiped them with the back of her hand, the same hand that had held surgical needles, that had guided instruments through cardiac tissue, that had kept people breathing when they shouldn't have been able to survive another second. That hand was steady even as everything else came apart. "Mom." His voice broke. "Mom, what happened?" She couldn't answer him. Not with the truth. Not with the part of her that was supposed to be dead. Not with the identity that the army had ordered into civilian life, that had been sealed and classified and buried so deep that even a background check couldn't reach it. And somewhere across the city, in an ICU bed at Oak Creek Memorial, Captain Miller was beginning to wake up. His eyes were moving beneath closed lids. His monitor was maintaining the rhythm that Brooke's hands had given him. And the first thing he would do when consciousness arrived would be to ask for the woman who'd saved him, the woman he'd recognized from Tikrit, from the operations that were supposed to be forgotten, from the ghost who wasn't supposed to exist in any official capacity anywhere in the world. He would ask for her? And the hospital would have no record of who she was. 2 days later, Captain Miller's eyes opened. The hospital room was still. Monitors beeped their steady rhythm. His gaze moved across the ceiling, then toward the door, and that's when he saw her. Standing in the doorway of the appeal hearing room downstairs. Her scrubs were gone. She wore a dark blazer over a white shirt. Her hair was pulled back. Her hands were folded in front of her, steady as surgical instruments. He whispered one word. "Valkyrie." The room went quiet. The hospital administrator stopped mid-sentence. The board members turned. Brooke's son stood from his chair. He'd been there to support her, to hear them tell her she'd never work as a nurse again, and he stepped forward. His voice was formal. Official. The way soldiers speak in dress uniform. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. Mother. That is her rank. That is who she is. Brooke didn't move. Didn't flinch. The administrator's face flushed. "I don't understand what." "You will in 30 seconds, her son said." Brooke reached into her jacket. The room held its breath. Her fingers found the lining she'd sewn herself 18 years ago, back when she still believed the military would call her back. Back before they'd buried the mission and ordered her to disappear. The patch was faded, the edges worn soft from 1,000 times she'd pressed her palm against it through the fabric. Desert tan. Arabic lettering. A single symbol that meant everything to everyone who'd ever carried it into hell. She held it up. The room didn't just go quiet. The silence became physical. One of the board members leaned forward. Another one stood. Then a man in the corner of the room stood. He was in civilian clothes, but his posture was military. His shoulders were broad as a linebacker's. The way he moved, fluid, economical, marked him as someone who'd spent more than 20 years learning how to kill efficiently and stay alive doing it. He was a Navy SEAL team leader. He'd been attending the hearing as a character witness for Captain Miller. His voice came out like a command issued at parade rest. Measured. Official. Navy Cross. He paused. The weight of that single decoration sat in the air between them. 2 silver stars. Another pause. Longer this time. The second silver star meant she'd been exceptional twice. Exceptional in ways that changed outcomes. That saved lives on scales the civilian world couldn't fathom. Purple Heart. Combat Surgical Specialist, embedded with JSOC Task Force 121 in Tikrit. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan served 15 classified operations across 3 tours. She was a ghost. A legend. And she saved Captain Miller's life in your trauma bay using hands that had held together things you'll never know about. The administrator's face had gone the color of hospital walls. Pale. Washed out. The door to the hearing room burst open. 3 people. Federal badges visible even before the leather cases flipped. FBI. 2 agents and 1 man in a dark suit who moved like someone used to moving fast. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, the lead agent said, reading from a tablet. "We've been investigating your billing practices for 11 weeks. Insurance fraud. Kickbacks. Falsified patient records worth approximately $847,000. We received alerts 2 hours ago when you attempted to forge Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan's personnel file. Attempted to erase her credentials. Attempted to fabricate disciplinary action against a federal asset." Hargrove's voice cracked. He'd been sitting in the back of the hearing room, waiting to hear Brooke's termination confirmed. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I was trying to." You were trying to obstruct a federal investigation into your own crimes, the agent said. Stand up. Hands in front of you. The handcuffs were stainless steel. They caught the fluorescent light as the agent ratcheted them tight. Click. Click. The sound was small and final. Hargrove's face went from pale to grey to something like ash. His mouth moved but nothing came out. The agent read him his rights in a voice that suggested he'd done this thousands of times. The other agent was already photographing him. The perp walk would be on the local news by evening. Dr. Hargrove, respected physician, being escorted out of Oak Creek Memorial in handcuffs. His colleagues watching. His patients watching. His network of favors and alliances suddenly worth nothing. They walked him past the nurse's station. Every nurse turned to watch. No one looked away. No one pretended to work. They stood there and watched Dr. Hargrove get led to a federal vehicle, and their expressions didn't change. But Brooke could read what was underneath: recognition. Relief. The kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from seeing someone finally held accountable. The news vans were already in the parking lot by the time they loaded him into the transport vehicle. The cameras caught him trying to shield his face. The footage would loop for 3 news cycles. Dr. Marcus Hargrove. 52 years old. 17 years at Oak Creek Memorial. Federal charges pending. 6 months later, the legal proceedings were finished. Hargrove had taken a plea deal. 23 months minimum security federal prison. Loss of medical license. Permanent revocation. His network had dissolved. The board members who'd taken his favors were distancing themselves. The outside investigators he'd hired had stopped returning his calls. Brooke was in her car, driving to her new assignment, when she saw him. A folding table outside a grocery store in a strip mall on the outskirts of Raleigh. The morning was clear. 73 degrees. The kind of North Carolina day that felt like an apology from the weather. Hargrove was wearing a name tag. It read, Steve. His hands were pale from months inside. He was selling supplemental insurance policies, the bottom-tier stuff that no one wanted, that paid almost nothing. His voice, when he tried to pitch customers, had lost its authority. It had lost everything. A woman approached the table. She asked a question. Hargrove's face went tight. For just a second, someone called him doctor as a reflex, and he flinched. Actually flinched. Like he'd been hit. Brooke drove past without stopping. Without slowing down. Without acknowledging he existed. In her pocket was Captain Miller's letter. He'd written it from his hospital bed before discharge. 12 pages. His handwriting shaky but getting steadier as he wrote. He'd talked about seeing a ghost walk into the trauma bay. About recognizing the way she moved, economical, precise, the way someone moves when they've trained for 17 years to save lives in the worst possible circumstances. He'd written about what it meant to be saved by someone who'd already given everything, who'd been ordered to disappear, who'd spent 3 years as just a nurse so that some bureaucrat somewhere could bury the fact that she'd ever existed at all. He'd written, "Thank you for being brave enough to be invisible so the rest of us could live." Brooke's son's hand was in hers. They were standing in the parking lot of Oak Creek Memorial. Her first day back. Not as a temporary employee. Not as someone under investigation. As the hospital's new director of trauma and combat medicine. The hospital had created the position specifically for her. They'd added a VA wing. They'd hired 3 former military medics. They'd established a scholarship for combat veterans transitioning to civilian nursing. The board chair had offered her the position with full knowledge of who she was. What she was. What she'd done. And Brooke had said yes to the trauma directorship, but only if she could still work patient care. Only if she could still wear scrubs. Only if she could still be in the rooms when people were dying and needed someone who knew how to bring them back. "My fight is here now," she'd told them. Her son squeezed her hand as they walked through the ER doors. Nurses turned. They knew. Everyone knew by now. The story had spread across every hospital in the state. The quiet nurse who'd been a ghost. The senior enlisted who'd saved a captain's life. The woman who'd been ordered to disappear and had done it so completely that even her own hospital didn't know who was walking their halls. One of the younger nurses, maybe 26, fresh from her first deployment, stepped out of the medication room. She saw Brooke coming. Her spine straightened. Not formally. Not rigidly. Just a recognition of something in the way Brooke moved. The way she carried herself. The kind of recognition that only comes from training alongside people who've learned their craft in places where mistakes mean death. The nurse nodded. Just barely. Brooke nodded back. That was all the acknowledgement either of them needed. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 18 years of holding herself so small that no one could see her. Of absorbing insults with one measured breath. Of wiping away a single tear without breaking eye contact. Of saying, "I've survived worse than you, doctor," in a voice so calm it had unnerved him because he'd recognized, in that moment, that he was threatening someone who'd already walked through fire and come out the other side unchanged. Now the fire was over. Now the hiding was done. Now the world could see her. She picked up a tablet from the nurse's station and reviewed the patient board. 3 trauma cases. 2 critical. 1 stable for now. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, checking labs, reviewing imaging, confirming medication orders. The other trauma surgeon, Dr. James Patterson, approached. He was 61. 3 decades of trauma experience. He'd heard the story. Everyone had. Trauma Bay 3 is yours, he said. Not a question. Not a request. A statement of fact. Acknowledgement that she was here and she was capable and she was exactly where she needed to be. Copy that, Brooke said, and she moved. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If you've ever been underestimated. If you've ever had to hide who you really are to survive. If you've ever known that the quiet person in the room might be the one holding everything together, share this story. Tell someone. And if you know a veteran transitioning to civilian life, mentor them. Show them that there's honor in the work that doesn't make the news. Show them that being a nurse or a medic or a healer is just as much a warrior's path as anything they did in uniform. Subscribe. Like. Comment. What would you have done in Brooke's position?